So if you recall sa Physics 71, I'm not really sure if nandito na kayo sa lesson nyo, but free fall is a situation where a falling object is only acted upon by Earth's gravitational force. Free fall is a case where you neglect air resistance and other forces like friction. If the object falls from a distance that's already relatively close to the ground, the gravitational force acting on the object is nearly constant. What does this mean? So the acceleration due to gravity experienced by your falling object, if it's near enough, is just a constant represented by g. So how do we describe the motion of our object? What we can do is use an appropriate kinematic formula that uses a constant initial velocity, constant acceleration, dependent on time. So you have equations for your position and your time-dependent velocity. So your acceleration has a value of 9.81 meters per second squared dito. May typo lang si manual nyo. So yung point ng experiment na to is to obtain instantaneous velocities and positions. Kasi ko-compare lang natin yung makuha nating data dito sa dalawang equations na ito. So now let's move on to graphical analysis. So ang graphical analysis ang magiging pinaka-basis ng experiment ninyo dito. So let's define the different parts of a graph. Naka-side-by-side view tayo dito para mas madaling makita kung ano ang tinuturo ng bawat part. So let's take this graph for example. Wait lang. Zoom in, zoom in. Okay. So a graph has different parts. So first is your axis. Basically, ito lang kung saan nakalagay ang bawat data point ninyo. So you have a horizontal axis, an x-axis, and a y-axis. Normally, ang independent variable ninyo, ang ilalagay niyo sa x-axis. Ang independent. While ang dependent variable nyo naman, ang nasa y-axis. So normal lang naman ito sa kahit anong graph, di ba? So let's not dwell on it on this much. So let's go for more detail. So one important part of any graph na ipe-present ninyo, kahit anong field man lang yan, hindi lang physics, axis labels. So you want anybody na hindi alam kung ano yung research ninyo or anong ginawa nyo to instantly know what they're reading. For example, tong graph na ito, nilabelan niya ng time in seconds and ang velocity niya, nilabel niya din yung y-axis niya. So very important yan na both kung anong quantity ang dinidescribe and kung anong units niya ang ilagay para madali lang basahin basically. Kasi imagine nyo na lang kung wala yan. So nobody aside from you will know what you are graphing. So these are very important details that you want to include. So next, we have our data points. These are basically how you represent your data in graphical form. So yung values ng data points nyo have a corresponding x and y coordinate that you can use to plot. So when multiple data sets are superimposed, which means more than one data set is represented in the same graph, the data sets are usually differentiated by using different marker shapes and colors. So let's look for a graph here na nag-represent nito, ang superimpose. Ito, may dalawang data set ako dito. Ang kulay blue dots ko represent a data set called velocity 1. On the other hand, meron akong another data set, velocity 2, na represented by orange dots. When I say superimposed, ibig sabihin lang, nakapatong lang yung dalawang data sets ko sa isang graph. Next, legends. Kapag may multiple data sets ako, I need some sort of guide to let me know what I am looking at. This is the legend. So for example, sa graph na ito, ang legend ko ang encircled portion na ito. This tells me kung which data set is which. Again, just like with axis labels, imagine nyo na lang kung wala tong legend na ito, how confusing it would be for somebody who does not know what you are representing, kung paano nila babasahin yan if they did not know. So these are guides for each data set. Okay? Error bars. Ang error bar ay basically a graphical representation of how you represent uncertainties. If you recall sa experiment 1, ang uncertainty ay isang interval where the true value lies. In the same manner, ang error bars are just a graphical representation. So kita niyo to, punta tayo dito. Itong parang letter I na malaki, or kahit yung mga maliliit actually, they represent intervals. So may data point ka, but this is an experimental measurement. Diba? It's not the true value. This means na yung true value mo may or may not be that actual value. Dahil nga for reasons like, ano nga bang reasons for uncertainty? Yun, limitation ng devices or whatever. So that's how you represent your uncertainties in a graph. For this experiment, by the way, we will not be doing error bars. So this is not actually a big concern, but this is just useful to remember and to know. So ito, trend line. Ito, this is a very important. A trend line describes the best fit line of your data. What does this mean? So basically, your trend line, itong mga dotted lines na to, itong maliliit, nagre-represent siya ng trend na fina-follow ng data points ninyo. For example, halimbawa ito, originally, ganito dapat itsura ng data points ninyo. These are just unconnected points. This is what they will look like if you plot them as is. If you add a trend line, you are determining a possible behavior of your data as you move on. So what is a good use of the trend line? Actually, hindi sinabi dito, pero ang isang magandang use ng trend line ay mag-predict ng values na wala sa dataset ninyo. So for example dito, I have a good trend line for my orange dataset. Itong trend line na ito ang nagde-describe dun sa data ko. While I don't know any data points beyond time is equal to 9.5, I can use my trend line to predict values, of course, to a reasonable doubt. So pwede siyang pang-extrapolate lang ng other data points. That is reliable to a certain degree. Ang isang kaakibat ng trend line normally ay ang R-squared value. Your R-squared value is a measure kung gaano kaganda ang fit ninyo. We are, sige, questions? Paano mo ko yung trend line? Yes, we will discuss that later. Maya-maya. Abangan. So yun yung next section natin. Okay, so continuing on, ang R-squared, actually more on statistics ito. So I won't dwell much on paano siya dinedefine. Pero ang point ng R-squared is you want it to be as close to 1 as possible. So for this trend line here, tingnan mo, 0.9988. It's very much close to 1. This tells me that my trend line is a good fit of my data set here. And lastly, this my title and caption. So yung title, nilalagay usually yan sa taas ng graph. Let's see. Ito, default lang ng Microsoft Excel, chart title. Nalagay lang sa taas. So it's it normally includes my dependent and independent variables of my corresponding experiment. Tingin tayo dito, baka may ano naman. Baka may example. Ito, title ko, V-T graph. This is enough to give me a good idea of what this graph is. Of course, idagdag mo dito sa ibang identifiers natin like my legends and axis titles. On the other hand, ang caption naman ay short but complete description of my graph. It's usually written in sentence form. Usually, but not necessarily. Ang captions normally ay longer than my titles and it can put more emphasis. So it's not an either, it's actually an either or situation. You can put titles or captions, pwede ring both. Ang caption sa graph na ito ay ito, tong part sa baba, tong figure, velocity versus time graph of a freely falling particle. So it's not in sentence form because it's not really required. So next, moving on. Before we discuss how we get our data, so let's first watch a short video on how the experiment is done. Stop share ko saglit. Dali lang. Share screen, share sound, optimize. Okay, we can watch this short video for a while.
Photo gates, like this one, can
May sound ba? Narinig niya ba?
be used to measure the movement of an object.
Narinig niya?
Opo.
Okay, good.
In this case, we're going to be looking at an object in free fall, and it's this picket fence. And the way a photo gate operates is there's a set of LEDs and detector. Tilt this down a little bit, and so you see there's a gap in there. And if an object blocks the beam, then you get the little red lights there. If I block both, I get both of those. And so for this experiment, the picket fence was dropped through there, and you can measure the velocity, the displacement, and whatnot. And so that's what we'll do here. So show you how it's collected. So I have it connected here to my iPad, and if I hit collect, I'm going to drop this on there. That. And now if I stop that and I come and I zoom into the data, I end up with a line here. To make mine look like the data that we have here, at least for the velocity side, I can come here and make this just points. There we go. Do that one, so we end up with that one. Now, to determine the acceleration due to gravity, I would like to find the slope of the velocity time graph. To do this, for my data set here, it's the graph for velocity is the one at the bottom. And so if I come here and apply a curve fit to that, I end up with a graph here from their data set. The slope here is 9.8 meters per second squared, so that should be about right. And so again, photo gates allow you to measure motion, in this case an object in free fall.
Okay, stop share ko lang saglit. Saan na yan? Oops. Okay, let's share screen na ulit. So, may natitignan yan. Saan na yan? Okay, so ito yung diagram nung basically yung experiment na pinakita sa video. Itong picket fence, hinuhulog mo lang and papadaanin mo siya dito sa parang C-shaped na photo gate. Kung mapapansin niyo, yung picket fence ay alternating black and clear. So every time na dumadaan sa, I think, the clear portion, habang nahulog siya through the photo gate, si computer mo ay magre-record ng distance and time. Siya naghulog. Iwan lang natin yan dyan. So, dahil we won't be able to do the actual experiment again, you will be doing more of data analysis. So, sa procedure na ito, of course, you will have to skip most of the steps and you will actually have to start your experiment with step 11. Yan, dito tayo magsa-start. So to answer yung question kanina, so let's do a demonstration of how to determine yung mga graphing natin as well as, of course, yung trend line na din. So this is an example of one dataset that you may encounter. Ganto basically pag nag-download kayo sa Ovle, ganto maging itsura ng dataset nyo. So papansin nyo, may gate 1 state dito. So when the gate 1 state is 1, this means that your data will record as in clear part ng picket fence dumadaan sa photo gate. And if your gate 1 state is 0, there's no recording happening. So when you get your data sets, to simplify your plotting, you can just basically delete all your columns na gate 1 state ay 0. Kasi wala naman data dito. So para mapadali buhay natin, delete lang natin yan. So your data is divided into 3 trials. Makita niyo naman mamaya kung para saan yung trials. So, how do we generate plots? If your Microsoft Excel version is not the same as mine, pwede kayo mag-consult sa akin. Let's try to explore it together. However, if naka-MacBook kayo, pwede ko pa rin kayong try tulungan, although baka mas mahirapan lang tayo ng konti. Anyway, let's move on. So the first step here is side by side natin. We will go to insert tab sa Microsoft Excel, tapos select charts. Sa version ko ng Excel, puro images na to, but for maybe some older versions of Excel, baka puro text-based naman yung ano natin. So we want to select scatter option. A scatter option is what we use when we represent experimental data. So next step, right-click the plot and select the data, select data option. So chart area, select data. Okay. Select your time values as your range of X values. So from select data, mag-add tayo. O sige, sabi daw time yung gawin nating independent. Gawin nating X. So series name muna. Pag mag-edit series kayo, baka magkalito dito kayo, mag-input kayo agad. Series name muna. So anong gusto nating i-plot? Position, XT curve. So for example, trial 1. So kapag maglalagay ako ng X values, what I can do is select 1, then just drag my mouse up to the last point where I want to plot. So yan, may data points na ako for X. Now, how about Y? Gusto ng manual ay position ang gawin kong Y. So, ang next kong gagawin, i-click ko yung series Y values. Ngayon, isang major source of error sa mga Excel users ay meron nang nakalagay na equals 1 dito sa series Y values nyo. Actually, nakakagulo yan sa data nyo. So, what you should do first, kung may nakasulat na dyan, burahin nyo yan. Para yung ilalagay nyo lang ay yung data nyo. So again, I will have to drag this. Yan, no? May na-plot na ako. Very nice. So, Just clicking OK. And OK again. Tapos yun na. If I want to add or superimpose another data set, what I can do is select data, tapos add ulit. So sabihin natin trial 2. Dito naman tayo sa kabila. So gagawin ko lang din ulitin ko lang dito ulit sa kabilang table dito sa data set ko. So okay. So next, under chart tools, click design and select quick layout. Okay. Normally yung chart tools or chart design, lalabas siya as a tab dito sa taas. But you have to select your graph to make it appear. So, for example, hindi ako nakaselect sa graph ko. Nawawala siya si chart design. Pag sinect ko, babalik siya. So, dito pwede mong gawin yung details. You can add chart element. So, axis titles, axis ko, time in seconds. The same way, chart title, axis titles, position in meters. Pwede rin ako mag-chart title, data labels, error bars, legend, etc. Actually, trend line pwede rin. But may mas more convenient way to make the trend line. So remove the grid lines daw. Remove daw. So you just select dito. Click nyo lang tong graph hanggang sa ma-select yung lines. And you can delete. Similarly dito, you can click the lines para magtapat. Magtapat kayo. You can delete. So yan, wala nang grid lines. So ito, how to determine the trend line. We right-click on the dot. Teka, yan, naklik ko yung dots. So, right-click. I have an option to add my trend line here. Kung makikita nyo, dun sa graph, automatic nang na-generate ang trend line from here. But note that, di ba mukhang hindi nakadikit yung trend line ko dun sa data points? That's because hindi nag-fit yung trend line ko sa data ko. Why is that? Can anybody tell me kung bakit hindi siya mukhang sakto?
Sir, kasi nag-accelerate.
Yes, that's partly the answer. But that's not the entire answer. Kasi kung titingnan nyo dito, sa VT graph ko, may acceleration ito, but yet it's still linear. Di ba? So that's not the entire answer. But that's partly correct. Ang reason kung bakit hindi... Yan. Oh, yes. Parabolic yung graph. That's the answer. If you recall dito, I'm plotting my x versus t. My equation 1 tells me that the kinematic equation is x naught initial position plus initial velocity times your time. Kung ito lang sana ang dalawang terms na to, linear yan. But I have an acceleration, a non-zero acceleration that's dependent on time squared. Kaya siya naging parabola. So of course, since expected ko na parabola ang data ko, pwede kong baguhin ang trend line ko to become a parabola. So in this case, I will select polynomial order 2. O yan, okay na. Halos fitted na lahat. Okay, balik tayo dito. Okay. So now that I have my trend line, I can opt to display the equation of the trend line and display its r squared. Oh, r squared ko is exactly 1. This means that my data perfectly fits my trend line. So as per the instructions, using the same trial, we'll do the same for speed versus time. You can just follow the exact same steps that I did. It's just the same. So, punta na tayo sa data sheet. So, ang data sheet natin ay results na acceleration per trial from the position versus time graph. So we have here trial 1, 2, 3. So itong trial 1, 2, 3 ay represented ng bawat isang section sa dataset niyo. Makita niyo na yan. How do I get the acceleration from the picket fence? I get my acceleration from my trend line equation. So kung mapapansin ninyo, ang form ng trend line ko ay isang quadratic equation, parabola. So instead of t, I am using a variable of x. So this means that bawat coefficient ko dito will correspond to a certain variable here. So I have here my x naught, may corresponding siya dito. Similar for v naught, may corresponding na valued coefficient. And C1 half A may corresponding coefficient din dito sa equation na to. So you will basically match coefficients to the appropriate order variable. Okay, so going back, next. After you do this, so percent best estimate, this is just your average. Percent error, nasa experiment 1 ito. This is just your deviation times 100%. Relative deviation times 100%. Balikan nyo na lang sa experiment 1. So next is graph. You want to graph superimposed for all 3 trials. So dapat complete yung lahat ng elements na described natin earlier. And as I said, for this experiment, there's no need for error bars. So you don't have to concern yourself with that. Superimposed, so what trial 1, 2, 3 sa isang plot. So table 2 and graph 2, you do the exact same thing, but for your velocity versus time graph. Oops. Kung pansin nyo, yung standard data tables nyo na makuha ay meron namang velocity experimental values din. So you will not have a problem doing this. You'll just do the exact same steps, only for a different column. And lastly, you have your standard questions. I think you should be able to answer questions 1 to 4 just using your theoretical knowledge on free fall. If I remember correctly, sa FQ1 ninyo, dapat na-cover nyo na ito. So, meron kayong reasonable basis. For example, sa question 2, suppose a heavy ball was used instead of the picket fence. So, ano mangyayari dyan? Anong difference ng free fall? Actually, you can use your lecture slides as Physics 71 to answer these questions. So ito, how does the kinematic equation change kung tinrow downward or upward yung object instead of just dropping it? How does that change your kinematic equations? Dito sa questions 3 and 4, when they ask you to sketch the graph, you don't have to make your own data points to graph it. You can simply draw over your original graphs and I will accept that. So lastly, sa question 5, comment on the accuracy and precision of your data. So you have multiple data points and you have a theoretical value of G, which is 9.8, 9.8. So how do you reconcile the concepts of accuracy and precision with your data? As for the second portion of the question, provide possible sources of error, huwag nyo nang gawin ito kasi you're not doing the experiment. I can't expect you to get a good feel of the sources of error since you don't actually do it. So for question 5, first part lang, okay na ako dun. So, yun lang kailangan nyo sagutin. So that's all for this experiment. May questions ba tayo? Kahit sa chat or wala naman? Okay. So again, for the rest of the time, you can do your experiment with your group mates. For today though, di ko iiwan yung Zoom meeting na bukas. What I will do instead na lang is doon sa Discord channel, my voice channel doon. Doon ako tatambay for today. Doon na lang kayo pumasok kung may gusto kayong tanong na questions through voice. Otherwise, you can also PM. So okay, that concludes